Hi, I'm Angela Fehr. I love watercolor, and my channel here is all about sharing my love of watercolor, teaching techniques to help you become your own favorite painter. I got this email from Kathy recently, and she had some questions about my palettes, and because I've recently changed palettes, she wanted to know a little bit more about that. So we're going to talk a little bit about palette care today, palette use, choosing a palette, how to fill your palette, and just some of the things that I've learned. Please remember that what I do is what works for me personally. There isn't any one single way to use watercolor materials. There's no single technique that everybody should use. It's really finding what works for you, your painting style, your climate that you live in, and then going with that and making it your own. So Kathy wrote me and asked, do you use the big round palette we see in your photo every day in your studio? Did you give up the other palettes you used to use? Is it confusing to have so many colors out, and are they labeled? And does your palette work with big brushes? Let's go over to my painting surface and we'll take a look at my palette that I use now, the ones I've used in the past, and I'll share some ways that I use them that work for me. We're gonna just move right over here. Woo! So as you can see, I have literally piles of palettes. They are stacked, and it wasn't always this way. When I first started painting, I had just one palette, and that's this one right here. This exact palette was the one I bought in 1995. I didn't know what I needed, of course, at that time when you're just getting started and taking your first class. So I bought what was available at the local art supply store, and that was this guy right here. You can still buy these. I usually get this one, which is very, very similar, from Reeves, and it's a large plastic palette. They retail for like $3. They're not expensive. And what I liked about this palette and why I used it for years was that it has lots of space for colors and lots of mixing areas as well. It doesn't come with the covers, so what I would do is if I needed to travel with it, it goes into a large, extra large Ziploc bag, and that just keeps it from contaminating everything else. You can also, if you're traveling with a palette like this, cover it with, it's called Glad Press and Seal wrap, and that wrap actually will stick to the plastic and seal off each individual paint well. As you can see, this palette is very dry. I haven't used it in a long time because last year I upgraded to this Robax palette, which is the one that Kathy was asking about in the email. And so we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. I just want to address quickly while we're here how my working method for using a palette with the paint preloaded into it. And one reason that you'll preload the paint is if it's your very first watercolor class and your instructor tells you to. That's how I got started. That was how my instructor used her paint, and her palette looked about like mine. It was kind of grungy and dirty looking. She didn't wash it between each painting session, and we artists were kind of hoarders. We don't want to lose any of the beautiful pigment, waste it away in our wash water when we rinse up at the sink. So I very rarely clean my palettes. We're also hoarders because we don't want to squeeze out fresh pigment and then have leftover fresh pigment that we then can't put back in the tube. And that's one reason why I pre-fill my palette. It gives me a better control over how much paint I use. I'm less likely to pick up too much than I would if the paint was moist and fresh from the tube. And I'm also able to reuse it. When I go to start a painting session, I spritz my palette with water, and just a light covering of water activates the paint on the surface of each pan, and it gets it ready for me to paint. Then it's really easy. Even though I haven't used this palette in months, I can still pick up nice rich saturation of pigment and immediately start painting. It's just that easy. No messing with trying to get those lids off the tubes, no squeezing them slightly too much so that the paint oozes out the instant it opens. All of that is eliminated. The palette does get a little grungy looking, and I have to let you know, as it starts to get down towards empty, this is when it's very hard to get a nice clean wash of pigment. The rest of the time you can usually, even if you contaminate, if I'm picking up red over here and then I grab some blue, the red is only going to sit on the surface of the paint. It doesn't go deeper than that. So to clean the paint, it's just a matter of just lifting off that top layer of paint if necessary. And you can do that with a thirsty brush. Just brush it, and that takes off any contaminating paint that might have come from other colors in your palette. When it starts to run low like this, I'm not going to get the beautiful pure new gamboge that was originally placed in here, but I can get new gamboge from another tube, or I can refill this and still use kind of this murky color when I'm mixing my paint, when I need that kind of maybe a greener yellow. So I can still use that, and I never have to feel like anything's wasted. I use my dirty paint, this dirty paint as well, to mix my beautiful neutrals. And I love a complex neutral that comes from painting with palette dirt. And so that's one reason I rarely clean my palette. Now, as I became a better painter, suddenly this small palette wasn't enough for me anymore. And it wasn't even that I became a better painter, it was that I became a more independent painter. I started thinking about the colors I really wanted to use. And I realized that the colors that were originally told to me by my first instructor weren't really cutting it anymore. I wanted to try something new. I'd read the Daniel Smith catalog, and I was falling in love with their descriptions of their beautiful colors. So I started ordering paint, and thus necessitated the need for another palette. And then that was when I started accumulating palettes. And now the problem with accumulating palettes is it does tend to be a lot of colors to think about. And certainly most of my painting is done with no more than 6 colors. I might have this many in my palette, but I don't use all of those for any single painting. I choose a root color, I choose some accompanying colors that go well with it, and I work with those. But having this big selection means I get to have a little bit more fun when it comes to choosing the first colors for a new painting. And so what I would do is stack my palettes and just kind of layer them slightly staggered. I could usually stack about 3 before it started getting precarious. So here now I have 3 rows of paint and then 5 mixing areas. And I would have one of those on one side of my painting area and one of them on the other. And that seemed to work for me for a long time. Keeping track of the colors, as you can see, I keep them in a generally in the same place. I keep the reds over in this corner. That blue is totally in the wrong spot, but I keep the blues usually over here. This palette happened to be a time when I ordered a whole bunch of browns, and so I put browns in this corner. Because I didn't buy all these paints at once, I added, this row of paint all at the same time, but everything else I'd had for years, so I already knew where everything else was. Adding these in made it easy for me to keep track of what was what. I just use a permanent marker to write the name of the paint along the edge. Even if you know which colors you're putting in, it's so easy to forget as you start to accumulate colors. Most of the time I don't need to look at the names until I start doing a video, and then then I always forget and give a color the wrong name. So having them written down is really helpful to me. Because if I'm gonna say the color wrong, it's gonna be on video when everybody can see it. Okay, so my new palette, and then I wanted to show you also these smaller palettes, because I think a lot of artists that you don't really want to commit when you're first learning, and so you'll buy a smaller palette. This one's made by Core. It's their half pan basic set, and there's 12 different colors in there. And this is made by Daniel Smith, and Daniel Smith these are new for Daniel Smith. This is Daniel Smith's floral set, and you can see these are half pans. They're much smaller than what I get in one of these, and they're smaller than one of these, which would be a full pan size. And a half pan, in fact I have a loose one here, you can see it in my hand. It's so small that it makes it really hard if you want to use these small palettes for painting bigger paintings. My favorite brush is this Escoda Versatile number 10 rigger. You can see how much my brush is going to rub against the side of the pan when I go to get paint out of here. It spends a lot of time stroking the plastic, and I can't put the side of the brush down into the palette the way I can here, where I can press the brush right in, there you can see it better, and fill up, really saturate that brush right up to the ferrule, which gives me a lot more paint to work with. In a minute, I'm going to talk about working in different climates, but I wanted to, and some of the properties of paint when you put it in the tube, but we'll just look at these palettes first. This is my travel palette. This is the one I take with me when I'm teaching a workshop, and so it's got mostly my basic must-haves. I took it with me to my Ireland workshop. We were in Ireland for a week in September teaching and touring that beautiful country. And this palette was almost perfect. I need to make a few changes. I didn't love this blue, which is the cerulean, and so I'm going to exchange that for probably Cinereous blue, which I really like, or Verditer blue from Daniel Smith. You know, when you're filling a palette for travel, really think about the colors you use the most. This palette is made by Robax, both of these, Robax.com, and they are really nice and sturdy and really deep. One mistake I made with ordering this palette was I did not order the inserts where you can actually take the pans out. And it's really nice to be able to take the pans out because you can move them around if you find that your color wheel is a little bit askew. If you're working with just 3 colors and you want to keep track of which ones you're using, I will actually pull them right out and put them beside my painting. Both of these palettes actually fit on the carousel so that you have a rotating palette, which I think is really nice. I'm finding that I'm really enjoying the rotation option here. And both of these palettes come with a lid. They also come with this tray. And I'm not getting paid by Robax to do this. They are just a small private company. And I encouraged him. I said, you should get your product on Amazon. And he's like, yeah, I don't really need to. He doesn't really want to. He likes just making them in small batches. And I like always working with individuals. So it's nice to be able to talk personally to the owner and designer about their product and their motivations for it. This is my big studio palette. It's a 64 well, 18-inch palette. This is the palette I use when I'm painting every day in my studio. I have a cover for it here, and that helps the pigments stay more moist, although I will occasionally leave the cover off if I've been doing a lot of painting and the pigment's extra juicy, because I like my paint to be a little bit firmer, so it's easier not to take too much. Oh, and in my climate, I don't have to worry about the paint molding. If you are in a humid, warmer climate and you've had issues with mold in the past, I can report that Daniel Smith encourages artists to try putting a little clove oil on a sponge and just putting that in your palette when you close it up, and that's supposed to help repel that mold-making bacteria. And so give it a try and let me know if it works for you. Don't put it right in your paints. We don't want to put oil in watercolor paints. That would defeat the purpose. But you can, find a way to have it inside of your palette to help keep that from becoming an issue. When it comes to palettes, I encourage you just to find a way that works for you. You don't have to spend a ton of money. There will be companies that will tell you they can make you a brass palette that costs $1,000. And there are people that insist on glass porcelain palettes and or enamel. I've used plastic palettes for years. With a plastic palette, the color will bead up a little bit when you've put that first puddle on. And Robax isn't too bad because they do kind of treat it to be a little bit textured. But if you're having trouble with your paints beading, you can do 2 things. One, you can be really patient, because as you mix paint in the mixing area, your brush will actually start to buff that plastic and give it a little bit of tooth, so the paint puddles more smoothly and is just a little bit easier to see the color and work with. Or you can use something to kind of rough up the surface. I like a Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. It has a microfiber scrubber that will just kind of give it a little bit of texture that you can't even see. But others have used a really fine grit sandpaper, a nail file, anything that you have that will just kind of give it that little scrub and help the paint just to pool just a little bit more nicely. As you can see, I already have really nice puddles here in this palette. So, and I haven't really done a lot of mixing in this particular well. A tip on how I filled my palette and managed to keep the colors in the relative color wheel is all I did was I just took this color wheel, placed it in the palette, and placed the colors approximately where the color wheel told me to put them. So my reds went over here and my greens went over here, yellow, blue, violet, etc. It does get a little bit tricky when you start to put in browns. Most of my browns fall on the orangey kind of side, so they're all over here. And I think I will I still have more colors that I haven't put in it that I'll need to put in like a backup palette. Maybe that will be a good place to place some neutrals that I want to have in my collection. The other, the deal with the inserts, of course, is if you do place a color a little bit off, it's really easy to take it out and move it to the appropriate location and swap out colors as you need to. When it comes to choosing colors for your palette, this can feel a little overwhelming when you see a professional artist working with 64 colors. Please don't feel like you need to have dozens of colors. Please don't feel like you need to have the colors that your instructor is using in order to have a successful result in painting. When we look at my paints here, we've got benzoyl something or other yellow right there, and we've got this cadmium yellow here, and we've got, well, that's the benz yellow again. So we've got the benz yellow, we've got the cadmium yellow, we've got a nicolazo yellow, and the difference between these yellows is really not significant. So when I'm looking at another artist and they're painting, I don't say what's the name of that yellow. Rather, I would say, what color is that yellow really? Is it a warm yellow? Is it a little bit close to school bus? Is it a cool yellow, a little closer to lemon? And I would choose my yellows based on that. So I can substitute without worrying about the color names. I don't need to know the pigment numbers. I just need to know the color family, basically. Is it a warm or cool iteration of that color? Over here in the blues, we have cool blues. They're going to be blues that are going to lean towards the green based. So there maybe a turquoise here is going to be a cooler blue. A ultramarine over here is going to be a warmer blue. It's going to be closer to violet. And the violets as well. We look at, is it a reddish violet? Is it a bluish violet? And then we choose our colors based on that. We mix our colors based on those principles as well. With the reds, we look for, is it a pinkish red, like a magenta? Is it a tomato red? And we choose, and ideally you have both of those reds in your palette already. You have a magenta or an alizarin crimson or a cherry red, and you also have that orangey tomato red. And then you mix your reds based on what you're seeing. Not only does this help save you lots of money and having to go out and buy paint every time you take a class, but it also helps you to become really good at color mixing and learn color theory so much faster than if you're paying sole attention to color names and pigment numbers. You're much better off looking at the color based on its temperature. Well, if you bore with me all the way to the end, then I know you really care about your supplies and you're interested in this topic of palette use and palette care. If that's the case and you have all these burning questions about palettes, you probably have burning questions about other materials and techniques in watercolor as well. So I want to invite you to join my Watercolor Beginner Bootcamp. It's a free event that's going to be happening in the last week of February. I'm putting together all the details right now. I'm making this available by invitation only. So if you're interested in joining, please do sign up using the link at the bottom in the description. Watercolor is such a beautiful medium, and you have my full permission to fall in love with it, and I'd love to help you do that. Join me and paint. Here on YouTube every week on my channel, I offer free lessons for you. I have full courses to really help you build your creative muscles and get really good at watercolor techniques at learn.angelafehr.com, and the free beginner bootcamp starting February 27th. Sign up below for your invitation to join the class. Thanks for watching. Happy painting.